With the success of this massive airlift of 14,000 Ethiopian Jews, almost every member of an ancient society had arrived in the modern age. It was an arrival fraught with conflicting emotions.
Frightened, confused, and it's just a very mixed feeling. Our Zionism was from our heart. That part made me very happy. Oh my God, I made it. That's it. That's Jerusalem.
All through the weekend they arrived, taking their first tentative steps in the Promised Land. Next year in Jerusalem was no longer a prayer. In one 4-hour flight, they traveled across centuries. They were about to discover how their dreams would compare with the realities of modern Israel.
They have tremendous differences to cope with. I mean, they have new food, they have new water, they have new weather. They have all these white people around that they've never seen before. They don't understand the language. They're just going through a tremendous state of shock, which is going to last for months. And then when they realize that their whole life is going to change, that their whole life they've been farmers, and now they're asked to work in factories or to do something like this. It's going to be a terrible strain on the whole generation.
Israel today is a young country, still less than 50 years old. A democratic Jewish state wrestling with all the conflicts and contradictions inherent in being a new nation. A new nation with a 3,000-year-old history. The Ethiopian Jews fled a country racked by years of famine and civil war. But in coming to Israel, they weren't entirely escaping conflict. Israel continues to be at odds with many of its Arab neighbors, yet it also remains home to more than 700,000 Arab citizens. Jews had lived in this land for thousands of years, but not until after the Second World War did the land of the prophets become a nation of immigrants from all over the world. Jews from Europe, Africa, and the Americas came to settle in the Promised Land, each wave arriving with its own history, culture, tradition, and problems. But the Ethiopian Jews are unlike any previous wave of immigrants. They were welcomed into Israel's highly competitive society, ill-equipped to cope. And so, like orphans, they were taken into the government's care for the first 12 months of their new life. The Diplomat Hotel in Jerusalem, the first home to several hundred new arrivals. Social workers, teachers, well-wishers, all come by to visit, and the Ethiopians adrift between two cultures are immersed in the wonders of Western society. Everything from fast food to flush toilets. People like social worker Danny Budowski are among the first Israelis whom the new immigrants meet. By speaking Amharic, the predominant language of Ethiopia, Danny helps ease their initial anxieties, providing a valuable bridge between the two cultures.
It's very important to show that their culture is important, and the way to do it is by using their culture, their proverbs, and of course learning the language. Proverbs are a wonderful way to communicate with the elders because that's the way they would talk. The one I'm using, and you can see them laughing, especially the elders, and reacting to it, is when I say "Kasbakasum kulal beigru hadal," meaning slowly, slowly will the egg of the chicken walk on its own legs, which shows the patience one has to have while being in Israel, learning a new language, learning a new culture, and it has to be patiently done until he can acquire this language.
Today, Danny will accompany a typically large family on their first trip to Tel Aviv. But before leaving, they offer all the traditional hospitality possible in the cramped hotel room, which will be their home for the coming year.
The husband was a farmer, like most Jewish families did in Ethiopia. He was quite a well-to-do family there because he had a couple of oxen, and he had horses, and he had sheep. He would work the fields, and his children would go out to the fields, taking care of the cattle and all that. The mother would work mainly at home and keep the home in good shape. They're flabbergasted by what's happening. They don't know what exactly it is. They're absorbing everything into them, very much impressed by what they see. Not always understanding what it is, takes a lot of explanation, and it takes a while to absorb these scenes. Balloon. Balloon. Wendy's, a nice American fast food restaurant, but for them, you don't eat in a restaurant with other people, with other outsiders. Usually it's a family thing or a village thing. You don't have people looking on you. It's not easy for them. Now the food itself is also something different. Meat being ground and presented to you in such a manner is something they're not used to, and they're very suspicious of. And even though they were very they wanted to make sure this is a kosher restaurant, they still were not sure they touched the meat, so that's why they didn't touch the meat. They only touched the bread and the potato chips.
Ordering food or crossing a street are simple skills acquired in a matter of minutes. But learning to thrive in this intimidating new world is a far greater challenge. Danny Budowski's help is vital, but it is only a fraction of the nationwide effort being made on behalf of Israel's newest citizens.
There's a kind of period that every new immigrant is allowed to feel protected and taken care of. Person could live, he wouldn't have to worry about work, he'd have money in his pocket, learn the language, look around for a job, and find the place he wanted to live with his family.
Israelis call this process absorption, and it begins with an intense period of schooling in the fundamentals of day-to-day life. Like their parents, young immigrants spend their days learning the language of their new homeland and playing games which help them adapt to Israel. For children, the novelty of life here is fresh and exciting. They rapidly grasp information and ideas, leaving the impression that the process of absorption can be smooth and simple. But for their parents, who came here steeped in an ancient cultural tradition, embracing a new life is far from easy.
Ethiopians are different because they come from a world totally unlike where other immigrants have been coming from for the past at least 20 years, meaning an undeveloped world. And The assumption is that the Ethiopians needed everything but more.
In this country of immigrants, every citizen can serve as an absorption worker, helping this next generation acquire the basic tools of a modern society, to begin feeling that they belong. As the newly arrived Ethiopians struggle to adapt, we can get a clue to their future by looking at the progress made by those who arrived in the early 1980s. Many are still heavily reliant on a support system which was intended to help them for just the first 12 months. For thousands of Jews who trekked to the Sudan, it's been more than 8 years since cultures and centuries collided.
They have problems of getting the job, living in an urban area, as opposed to a village which was small and very condensed, very cohesive. But where they were familiar with everything, with everybody. Here, they are put in a city. Even if it's a small town, it's still not the same as a village. The language problems and barrier, the mentality, the food, the taste, the dress, the clothes that they wear. They are still in a process of making it in Israel. They do need help.
Michael Babu works with Ethiopians who have lived in Israel for several years. In this bomb shelter in Jerusalem, he runs a new social club for these young immigrants, most of whom now speak mainly Hebrew, having almost forgotten their parents' native language.
They said, we are dealing with few problems. We all attend boarding schools all over the country. We have something in common that we are of Ethiopian origin and that our parents are living in Jerusalem. But when we come for the weekend, we don't know each other. We go out in the streets of Jerusalem. We see Ethiopians, youth, but we don't know them. We just know that we are Ethiopians. We have a lot in common, but yet we have nothing in common.
It's difficult to imagine these teenagers cloaked in rags, starving in a Sudanese refugee camp. But that was their history, and Michael Babu believes that retelling their stories will help them understand themselves and each other.
A lot of them came when in the age of 6, 7, 4, 5. They do not really remember exactly. Remember they walked. Remember they were taken from one place to another. And by sharing it with the whole group, by seeing that each one has his own unique story, but similar, it creates some kind of group feeling, group cohesiveness.
The confusion and alienation of these teenagers is both a normal function of adolescence and a natural result of the immigrant experience. The universal need of adolescents to model themselves on an adult generation with strong roots and a sense of self-esteem is frustrated. Adult Ethiopians are themselves struggling with a sense of rootlessness.
Older people who came around the age of 40 or 50, they were simple farmers in Ethiopia. They have a hard time to study, to learn the language. They can't find a real job that will fit them. And most of the time, many of them just sit at home and get social security, money, and don't do anything special.
The Ethiopians' tightly knit patriarchal society has largely disintegrated since their arrival in Israel. Adult men find themselves humiliated, taught and trained by their far more adaptable children. As a result, they lose face, respect, and authority.
Because the younger generation lost the respect for the older generation, the older people really don't seem that they have any aim or in their life in Israel and feel very much frustrated and are quite lost.
Ironically, while men have been set adrift by this process of absorption, many women have been able to seize opportunities never before available to them in their traditional village societies.
Women who have money, it runs counter to the Ethiopian culture, because in Ethiopia the men handle all the economic matters in the family and not the women. They find that working gives them a lot of strength, and they have money that they can use for their own purposes, and they want freedom.
In the Jewish tradition, what is important is every person should be able to make his living and be able to take care of himself and his family. The Ethiopian Jews come with that value. They come from a world where there's a certain term, it's called govez, and there's no word in English or Hebrew that touches on it, because it combines being strong and brave with being smart. And that's a wonderful combination for getting ahead in Israel, just like it was for taking care of yourself in Ethiopia. But if the people absorbing him don't know that value, they can project on him their fantasies. What are their fantasies? That he comes from a backward country, a primitive culture, that he needs to be encouraged, he needs to be helped. So instead of independence, you can turn it into a kind of dependency. And dependency has a certain seductiveness to it.
And not just for the Ethiopians themselves. Every gift needs a giver, and there's an age-old Jewish tradition of helping those less fortunate.
And every day I tell a group, you're here at the most important moment in history. You know that we cannot fail. You know that we must succeed, that we must do everything possible to make these immigrations work.
The Western Jewish person sees somebody black and he assumes, it's not only a Jew, but a black Jew. What a double sort of whammy, if you will. Here is the really ideal, typical, helpless Jews who were persecuted in Ethiopia and have everything going against them. They're black and they come from a poor country, and everything is such that they need everything we can give them, our money and our support.
Okay, get everybody over there to smile.
So for at least 50 years, there's been a Save the Falasha movement, a Save the Ethiopian Jews movement, and it's a big movement. And people are enthusiastic and feel noble when they contribute to that. Now, what happens sometimes is that the Ethiopian Jews play to that kind of audience. And that comes back to the idea that they can make themselves just a little bit more helpless than they really are. Now, sometimes it's done with consciousness so that they can take care of themselves perfectly well, but if somebody wants them to be somehow needy, they can say, yes, we're needy. Or if somebody wants them to have been persecuted terribly in Ethiopia, they can say, yes, we have hundreds of years of persecution at the hands of the Ethiopian kings, even though when it's not exactly historically true.
It now appears that for decades, contact between the Jews of the West and the Ethiopians has been built on a foundation of misconception. Myths about their history continue to be passed on as fact.
For many years, people have viewed the Jews of Ethiopia, and this is still clearly their popular image, as a lost tribe that reached Ethiopia. Some people say 2,000 years ago. Today you most commonly hear 2,500 years ago. And after Ethiopia became a Christian country, a remnant of Jews survived and held on to their faith. Today, more and more scholars are saying that the Jews of Ethiopia are a group that developed in Ethiopia 500 or 600 years ago. So they're not a lost Jewish tribe. They're an indigenous Ethiopian phenomenon, an Ethiopian ethnic group. During their history in Ethiopia, the Jews of Ethiopia made various decisions that were connected to their survival. In the 20th century, a large group of them make a decision to go the path of entering mainstream world Jewry. And that has a price. In order to become like the rest of world Jewry, they need to develop a relationship with world Jewry, which is essentially a relationship of dependence. As much as world Jewry is interested in giving things to the Ethiopian Jews develop a clear sense of this is an alternative route to success and to survival. accepting from world Jewry, whether it's money, whether it's teachers, whether it's help in getting out. And this dependence only increases over the years. So if you had to take one major characteristic of the relationship between world Jewry and Ethiopian Jews, it's the growing dependence, which begins with very subtle processes and culminates in a virtual total dependence.
Almost complete immersion in Western values inevitably leaves the Ethiopian community in Israel feeling besieged. And many older Ethiopians express concern that integration and assimilation might eradicate their traditional culture. The question is, what can be preserved and how best to do it?
I think the Ethiopians will fight for their culture, or some aspects of their culture, and won't be taken away from them and they won't lose it. But we don't know what those aspects are. And sometimes we again project what we think is important about their culture and what they ought to preserve with what they really are going to preserve. Ethiopians had a way of having a wedding, and here in this country, they say there's no tom, there's no real taste to the way Israelis do their weddings. But they're in Israel, so they make a little bit of a compromise. What they do is they will have the Israeli-style wedding from 7:30 to 11, and then when all of the Israeli or the non-Ethiopian guests go home, then they'll go to a special place, a hall or community center or somebody's house, and they'll dance the night away, and they'll have the foods and the drinks that they were familiar with.
An Ethiopian nightclub in Tel Aviv for immigrants who are finding their footing in their new homeland and gaining the self-confidence to be Ethiopian again, as well as Israeli. This nightclub is one of several businesses springing up around the crowded central bus station. There are also restaurants, a music store, and a beauty salon, all symbols of an emerging independence, indicating a culture still very much alive.
Tradition is vital, tradition is alive, tradition is changing. People don't sit around in traditional societies and say, we can't change anything, it's tradition. It's only when you're challenged, it's only when you're threatened that you become aware and say, well, we need to keep things the same. But ultimately, traditions change. The Ethiopian Jews have always changed throughout their history, and there's nothing inauthentic about changing. The important thing is that the Ethiopians be the ones who make the selection of what they wish to keep.
እሷን መርዳት ያስፈልጋል በይበልጥ እሷን መርዳት እና ደግሞ ልጆችን በጥሩ
Ethiopian elders participate in an experimental counseling program, an attempt to integrate ancient village traditions into modern society.
The Ethiopians have a very wonderful concept called the father of the soul, and every Ethiopian Jew needed to have a father of his soul, meaning generally a kes who he could come to talk to deal with his problems, to confess to if something wasn't going well, to get advice from. Now, when the Ethiopian leaves that behind and comes here, there aren't enough kesim to take care of that function. People are spread out in different places. So the Ethiopians, at least the older generation, finds itself sort of bereft.
Often, Ethiopian Jews who sought Israeli advice and guidance found their confusion compounded by the cultural differences and misunderstandings of their Israeli counselors. These Ethiopian counseling sessions reestablished the historical role of elders as fathers of the soul. An ancient village custom survives to remedy decidedly modern problems.
ከዚያ ችግር ከነበረው ሁሉ ችግር ዛሬ ጥቂት ታግሶልን እናገኛለን።
It's been almost a decade since the first wave of Ethiopia's Jews began assimilating with Israeli society. Some have since graduated from the country's universities. Others have joined the armed forces or started small businesses, like this restaurant, where traditional injera is now made in a modern kitchen. In order to survive, each generation of immigrants has had to embrace Israeli culture and move further away from the traditions of their homeland.
I remember what I wanted to do was to know more Hebrew, to know about Israel, to know about the people. So I don't have time to keep my own culture, my own language, my own everything. But now, after 10 years, really I do need to speak sometimes in Amharic, which is Ethiopian language, and maybe to eat Ethiopian dish, and to be somehow Ethiopian, not more Israeli. So now, I'm more Israeli, but I would like to keep my some Ethiopian.
As time passes, virtually every immigrant yearns for the world they left behind, and often they seek to recapture just a little of their past. Back in Ethiopia, the search for the few remaining Jews who were left behind is nearly over. In the village of Walaka, Dr. Rick Hodes delivers antibiotics to a man bitten by a snake. The man is not a Jew, but maintaining goodwill with the non-Jewish villagers is in everyone's interest.
This is the synagogue where people have worshipped for a countless number of years. Now it's been occupied for 1 or 2 years by this family who moved in from Gondar city. Probably within 6 months there will be no more Jews in Ethiopia. It's really a loss, and I hope that the Ethiopian Jews in Israel will get educated and be able to go back and forth, and that both Israel and Ethiopia will benefit from them.
This is perhaps the most thriving Jewish Ethiopian village remaining in Ethiopia. It was constructed in 1990. Not in the remote Ethiopian highlands, but within the walls of the Israeli embassy compound in Addis Ababa. The Jews who live and work here are the last vestiges of a people who have now largely disappeared from the Ethiopian landscape. They wait here patiently for the new non-Marxist government to grant them permission to join their relatives already in Israel. Like the thousands who preceded them, it's difficult to anticipate the hardships and challenges which await them. All that matters here is that they be allowed to leave this village behind. Most Ethiopians were unaware that they and their ancestors had coexisted for hundreds of years with the Jewish community, so their absence will probably have little or no impact on the day-to-day lives of their former countrymen. But in Israel, the arrival of Ethiopian Jews was an extraordinary event that captivated the imagination of the whole country. What impact, what contributions might their presence make here?
We can learn patience. To learn to be patient with each other, show respect to each other. To be patient about what's happening around you is an important value, and we don't always have it.
You feel the presence of the Ethiopian by means of his quiet, his silence. He speaks without saying so many words. He makes an impact by just being there, not talking. Personally, I believe that there's a very great power in soft talk and soft words. Maybe there'll be diplomats, maybe there'll be psychologists, something that has to do with interpersonal sensitivity.
They're going to teach us to re-examine many of our basic assumptions about what is Jewishness, what is essential in being an Israeli, what sort of people are we, and where is this country heading as we go into the next generation of Israeli society with a very, very different population from the past.
They have a lot of things to offer to the Israeli society. By their manners, by their politeness, but by the way they control themselves, by their kindness, by the way they are so gentle and so nice, so respectful to each other. Things that in Israel I think we are lacking.
They've gone from Waleka in the 16th century, basically, to within hours to Israel. They've lost their agricultural lifestyle. They've lost their prayers in the Waleka synagogue. Many of them had never seen a telephone, certainly had never seen television. And to deal with this, it's a tremendous strain on them. I mean, with really irreversible consequences. Despite all these problems, and I realize that I'm part of this, and I'm one of the people pushing them into this new society, at their request, we're all very happy that they're in Israel, and we wish them a great future.
A highly developed but ancient people is taking its first tentative step into modern society. The forces in Israel that are overwhelming their old culture are the same forces that are eroding traditional cultures all around the globe. As traditional cultures blend with our modern world, we must all decide what should be sacrificed, but more importantly, what should be, without question, preserved.
Sure.